From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
It was another momentous term at the U.S. Supreme Court as the justices barred racial preferences in admissions, put new guardrails on the federal bureaucracy, and buttressed free speech against would-be censors. What do the decisions tell us about the second full term with the new majority, and will there be some kind of political backlash? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with court watchers and political watchers, Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Welcome to you both. Kyle, the press is reporting that the court this year seemed to be chastened somewhat by the criticism it received after the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade last year. And so this year was more cautious. I have to say, I don't really look at it that way with one or two exceptions, but how do you see it?
I guess I would agree with you. Striking down affirmative action policies, racial preferences in college admissions, elite college admissions, does not seem like a particularly tentative move to me. But to me, this seems like a strong year for the Supreme Court, this conservative court, though with the caveat that these are idiosyncratic conservatives. And it is not always easy to predict sometimes when one or two of them is going to break away. And so one of the things I always look for is the statistics that come out at the end of every term. And here's a particularly interesting one from Empirical SCOTUS. So the justices that were in the majority this term, most were Brett Kavanaugh, 96% of the time, and John Roberts, 95% of the time, followed there a little bit by Amy Coney Barrett, 91% of the time. But then, interestingly, some of the conservatives were lower than some of the liberals. So Clarence Thomas was in the majority 76% of the time, and compare that to Elena Kagan, 80%, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, 84%. And so I think that's a particularly fascinating statistic to look at because it complicates this narrative. Yes, we have a conservative court, but we have conservatives who are following their own textualism and their own originalism down some paths that sometimes lead them to line up with those liberals and give a result that the public wasn't expecting.
Take your point on the shift in percentages there, but those percentages are often reflective of what are a lot of cases which aren't that controversial, which aren't that politically salient. They're on fairly technocratic views of the law, and often they're unanimous. Elena Kagan, for example, exceeding Clarence Thomas in the majority. It's on the big controversial cases with big political implications where I think the 6-3 majority that emerged, particularly at the end of the term, showed itself to be rather unified. And Kim, I want to make a point here. One of the things that was interesting to me about this term was that Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, really did put his stamp on this term. He was the author of two of the last three big cases, the racial preference and admissions case and on the student loan case. Now, he, as in the majority, when he is in the majority as the chief, he gets to sign who writes the opinion. So if he wants to take an opinion and he's in the majority, he can. And one of the things that my old legal mentor and friend Larry Silberman on the D.C. Circuit suggested to me would happen when Amy Coney Barrett was appointed and made that sixth conservative justice was that you'd see John Roberts get out in front and be with the majority, less the swing vote, then he would be part of the 6-vote majority since he didn't want to be part of any minority or didn't want to be seen in the minority in a lot of 5-4 votes. And I think we saw that this year on some of these big cases. Now, I will say this, on a couple of those cases, like the racial preferences case, it's utterly consistent with Chief Justice's jurisprudence over the course of his career.
Right.
And I think also on the regulatory case on student loans. So I'm not saying he would necessarily have been in the minority in those cases like he was in Dobbs last year. But I think it's interesting that the chief himself is now grabbing some of these opinions and putting his stamp on them.
Yeah, and I would say not just in terms of the opinions, but the decision to take up the cases as well. In the beginning, remember, this was a court that for many years seemed to duck and dodge some of these big issues that were coming along. We've seen them with a new interest in settling some areas of law that have been very confusing for a long time. And I agree with you entirely, Paul. That to me is the kind of big takeaway from this court and its term is that, yeah, we had a number of technical rulings where there were alliances between right and left justices, but on the big cases, not only was there a court willing to go 6-3 along those ideological lines at times, but that the chief was in the majority. That was the case with the student loan case, the case with racial preferences, 303 Creative, which was about this website and public accommodation, which was a big free speech victory. The wetlands case we had, another big case that reined in bureaucratic power. That was the Sackett case and gave some clarity to what counts as the definition of wetlands. A lot of really good, powerful decisions, landmark victories, if you would. And as you noted, whereas last year, the chief kind of found himself out in the cold, unable to convince some of his colleagues to come along with him, especially on that Dobbs case. This year, he showed himself willing. He wanted to lead this court and was willing to do so on those big landmark decisions.
Kyle, I want you to elaborate a bit on what you said earlier about these justices are idiosyncratic conservatives. That suggests they have maybe some oddball views. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying that they look at the text and the originalist Constitution and they make different judgments based on how they read it?
Yeah, I just mean that textualism and originalism are methods of interpretation, but it's not like mathematics where 2 + 2 = 4. There are different textualist methods and different approaches to some of these questions that lead some of these conservatives along to different outcomes. And you saw that in even some of these big cases, the Sackett v. EPA case on wetlands. So that was a 5-4 decision. And Justice Brett Kavanaugh peeled off in that one. You also see it in some ways with Justice Neil Gorsuch, maybe the most. There were a few times that he teamed up with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on the left for some concurrence or dissenting opinion. And Justice Neil Gorsuch in particular on criminal law seems to have a view that courts should have a bias. Maybe bias is not the right word. Courts should construe the law with lenity toward people whose freedom is potentially on the line if they're convicted of this crime. And so, there are just different methods of interpretation that sometimes lead to these results where you may have 5 of the conservative justices sticking together and 1 or 2 peeling off.
I think that's a very interesting observation. I would also point to a couple of cases where it looked like both the chief and Brett Kavanaugh were more inclined to stick with precedent and less inclined to overturn it. And that was a couple of the election law cases. An Alabama redistricting case where the conservatives were, Justice Alito and Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas were in dissent, as the chief and Brett Kavanaugh declined to rewrite the precedent of the Gingell's precedent on districts. And then that's going to have a big impact potentially on federal elections in 2024 because it's going to create probably an additional seat in Alabama and maybe in other states. And there was also the case in North Carolina regarding, towards the end of the term, Moore v. Harper, which involved how much state courts would be able to challenge legislative redistricting. In that case as well, Kavanaugh and the chief sided with the liberals. So there might be a sense in which they don't want to be that aggressive in overturning precedents, given the criticism they've received. On the other hand, sometimes there's an accusation that they've overturned precedent when it's not really true. And let's listen to President Biden talk about that in the racial preferences case.
Today, the court once again walked away from decades of precedent and as the dissent has made clear. The dissent states in today's decision, quote, rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress, end of quote. I agree with that statement from the dissent. The court has effectively ended affirmative action in college admissions, and I strongly disagree with the court's decision.
Kim, I read the opinions in this case, and the Chief Justice could not have been clearer that this was not overturning precedent. This was cleaning up 45 years since the Bakke case in 1978 of the court being on both sides of the preferences issue.
Right.
It was cleaning up and finally issuing a clear statement about what the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment actually says about racial bias.
That's right. We had a court that in the past had allowed racial preferences to proceed. But even in that situation, they have made clear that it could not survive if it engaged in certain things like stereotyping, etc. And what the court essentially did, in my mind, the way I like to look at it, is it realized that you simply couldn't have a racial preferences program that didn't create these kinds of problems. The very things that they said couldn't be allowed under racial preferences. So they finally decided to adopt a clean view of the 14th Amendment. I mean, I think it was a great day in that we have a court that was willing to acknowledge that for, 50 years, we'd set up an unworkable system. And so it was holding true to many of the same things it had said in the past, that we need to have an equal enforcement of things under the law. And so this couldn't be farther from the truth. The minority certainly wanted to suggest so, because it is somehow invested in suggesting that this majority is going off the rails because that's its way of trying to pressure, as it were, the other justices into not taking up some of these big issues and not ruling a way that they would rather not. I think it's unfortunate that the president is doing this, because we do have this problem with a drop in faith in the Supreme Court. That is not because the court has necessarily is in any way breaking its own fidelity to the law, but rather because political actors are trying to pressure it.